Good morning. Alex didn't quite get his research right. I was never an opera singer. I briefly had a fantasy about singing. When I lived in Germany for a year, I lived in Düsseldorf and Frankfurt. I was very lonely. It was the early 1980s. The only social life I got was joining the local choir. And I joined the Bach choir in both Düsseldorf and Frankfurt. And then I got very attracted to the German musical community, which is one of the many ways in which you produce great communities at the local level, and which probably is fading. It certainly has faded a long time ago in Britain. Philippa asked me to do this speech today, and to some degree to reproduce what I said in London about free market capitalism about 6 months ago. But as I thought about it, I realized I was speaking to a German audience, and that some of the things that you might say when you criticize Anglo-Saxon capitalism don't actually apply in a German context. And you have many aspects, your model is different, and many aspects are things that we in the Anglosphere could learn from. Having said that, I've tried to knit together a speech which kind of talks about the Anglo-Saxon failings, but also incorporates what your challenges are today in Germany. So in my 15 minutes, I want to tell the story of free market capitalism. How on the one hand, it is the secret to human flourishing and prosperity, and how on the other, it is a fragile plant, which in the wrong hands can wither and die. I will also try to interweave the story of three German or German-speaking economists, Marx, Schumpeter, and Ludwig Erhard. But more of that later. First of all, the good news, human flourishing. If you had been born in 1750, your life expectancy and your standard of living would have been pretty much the same as someone who had been born 2,000 years earlier. For 2 millennia before the year 1800, human development more or less flatlined. Most of the planet lived in what is today classified as extreme poverty. Then, as we saw in the film, something happened. That something was the way scientific innovation and free markets came together to create the Industrial Revolution. GDP per capita started rising, first in Holland and Great Britain, and then beyond. In these countries, GDP rose as much in 50 years as it had risen in the previous 1,800 years. Germany, by the way, overtook Great Britain in GDP terms, you probably know, 1908. Economic prosperity has led to human flourishing. In the last 75 years, extreme poverty across the world has fallen from 90% to 10%. It has halved in the last 20 years alone. Free market capitalism is the greatest instrument of poverty relief that the world has ever seen. But free market capitalism is a fragile flower. It needs to be planted in the soil of shared values, trust, and integrity. And it contains within itself the seeds of its own destruction. And this is where we come to Karl Marx, of course, and to Schumpeter. They both saw the risks for capitalism, but drew radically different conclusions. Marx believed that in their chase for ever higher profits, the capitalists would shed workers for machines. Industries would inevitably tend towards monopoly and toward the extraction of rentier profits. The workers would be alienated and revolt. Because Marx had upon him the mark of Cain, he did not really like capitalism or capitalists, and so he rejoiced in these outcomes. Schumpeter was different. He considered himself an entrepreneur, and he loved free market capitalism. Joseph Schumpeter predicted that free market capitalism would end in a form of corporatism, not so different from socialism. He found the prospect horrifying. And so that brings me to corporatism. In Germany, the word corporatism doesn't have such a bad press as it does in the Anglo-Saxon world, because it is understood that at the local level, business leaders have a responsibility to participate in their community and to collaborate with local leaders for the benefit of the town or village, whether that be by fixing the local football pitch or making sure that vocational training is delivered properly for all. But that is very different from what happens when capitalism goes global. Then, corporatism is not about fixing the local football pitch. It is about fixing prices or fixing the industry so that corporate executives can maximize their earnings from their option scheme. That is cronyism. Now, I looked up cronyism in the dictionary for translations, and it appears there is no German translation. There's a French translation, there's a Spanish translation, there's even an Arabic translation. But the only version I can find of German is Chrony Capitalist. That probably reflects the fact that it's not seen as such a problem here. But in our globalizing world, cronyism is becoming rife, and it is coming your way. The main expression of cronyism is lobbying. US corporations spend over $2 billion per year lobbying in Washington, D.C. European corporations spend over €1 billion a year lobbying in Brussels. We even have an exclusive venue not far from here where the cronies gather once a year to collude in the most efficient way possible on a global scale. I'm afraid to say that Davos was run and founded and is run by a German, but he was a Swabian. And we, I am pleased to say, are Bavarians. So crony capitalism is a form of what you might call elite capture. And elite capture would, I suppose, be acceptable if the elites could be relied upon to be virtuous and visionary. If they had the vision of Ludwig Erhard, or Lee Kuan Yew, or the courage of Margaret Thatcher, then maybe we would be in a different place today. But what we have today is a near ubiquitous case of elite failure. Das Versagen der Eliten. And I want to touch on 3 particularly bad manifestations of it. First of all, inequality. 2008 still casts a long shadow over Western politics, as everyone saw how the bankers played the politicians for patsies. In the aftermath of the financial crisis, most bankers were able to get away scot-free. They privatized their gains and socialized their losses. Then, in the aftermath, 10 years of quantitative easing enabled bank CEOs to enrich themselves and their staff through the merry-go-round of rising asset prices and lavish buybacks. Financial wealth always compounds faster than GDP, as Thomas Piketty has pointed out. But quantitative easing puts this geometric equation on steroids. And the wealth of the 1% has just gone further and further away from the rest of the population. In parallel to this, the opening of world trade to China in 2001 has led to a huge and very rapid hollowing out of most Western economies, as many traditional manufacturing industries were competed out of existence. In a world of accelerating globalization, business leaders have not necessarily needed to worry about this. In the Anglo-Saxon world, especially, Business leaders no longer live next to the factory they are closing. They don't even live in the same town. The decisions they take about business strategy are digital rather than analog. They don't have to live with the human consequences. It is the rising anger at this hollowing out of what people now call flyover country, which is driving American and British politics today. And it is what lies behind, and some would say justifies, the rising protectionist tide, which will only accelerate if Trump wins the presidency. Germany has not been subject to the same levels of hollowing out or social and industrial decline as other Western economies. You only have to look around you in Bavaria and see the comparative wealth compared to rural areas in Britain or France. This is partly because of your great Mittelstand tradition, where companies are more integrated into their communities and business leaders still feel great responsibility for their local employees and communities. But it is also, if we are honest, because of how well the German mercantilist model has done out of the EU in terms of being able to outcompete your neighbors in the euro and insulate yourselves to some degree from global competition. Nonetheless, you do have your equivalent of flyover country in the former states of East Germany. You even have your own word, and I looked this one up too, Überflugland. You have your own issues of inequality, which are leading to the polarization of your politics. And you're about to be hit by a new wave of dislocation driven by climate policies. This brings me to my second example of elite failure. And here, I'm afraid, Germany is what we call the poster child. And I'm going to try and pronounce this correctly, Klimahysterie. This is going to be the focus later today, and so I will only touch on it briefly and leave it to Bjorn to guide you. I'm happy to accept the IPCC forecasts for temperature increases. They are forecasts. They will be approximately right, probably. The problem is not with the climate forecasts. It is with the way they have been weaponized by politicians to devise interventions in the economy which cause enormous disruption and which demand enormous sacrifices overwhelmingly on the backs of the poor. You in Germany are the Spezialisten. Germany, GDP is energy transformed. Your strengths as an economy were overwhelmingly focused on industries dependent on cheap energy, chemicals, capital goods, automobiles. By closing down your nuclear industry and making Germany dependent on Russian gas, Merkel jeopardized the future of your entire economic model. Energy costs in Europe are currently 5 times as high as those in America. Electricity costs in Germany are 4 times higher than the United States. Gas costs are nearly 6 times as much. What Germany has done to itself is an act of economic self-harm. Some would call it unilateral economic disarmament. Unless you restore your competitiveness in energy, you're set to suffer a wave of deindustrialization which will make Düsseldorf look like Detroit without the music. The third example of failure, of elite failure, is woke capitalism. Woke capitalism, and this obviously wasn't invented here, but it's coming your way. Woke capitalism is the imposition of a top-down ideology on the free market system by politically motivated bureaucrats, either from the public or the private sector. Their ideology is framed through ESG, environmental social governance. In the context of the Anglo-Saxon economies, the origin of ESG is a legitimate one. It started with a vacuum of corporate governance. Corporate governance in the Anglo-Saxon equity markets has not worked well for a long time. This is because of a genuine market failure known as the agency problem. Fund managers, like me, have mostly failed or refused to deliver proper governance on behalf of the beneficial owners who actually own the shares, mainly because it is too burdensome and too expensive. This left a profound governance gap. Into this space stepped Larry Fink, the indexation industry, and the United Nations. They have created a standardized, one-size-fits-all, ideologically based governance taxonomy. Now, Germany is different because of your tradition of Mitbestimmung. You had stakeholder capitalism long before the British embraced the term. You didn't have a corporate governance deficit. You had your problems with Volkswagen and so, but you didn't really have a corporate governance deficit. But you are part of the EU. And the EU Commission in Brussels has a tradition of finding solutions to problems that don't exist. And so this year, they are imposing a new ESG framework, the ESGR, on all quoted European companies. Some 50,000 companies will be affected. All companies will be scored on the basis of taxonomies created by bureaucrats far removed from the challenges of running a business. In the case of Germany, this is simply regulatory overload. Regulatorische Überlastung. The underlying problem we face today is a loss of virtue and wisdom in politics and business. Free markets only truly prosper in societies where there is a proper shared understanding of virtue and mutual honor, where people remain in right relationship with each other, and where there is a proper sense of mutual responsibility. The biggest danger to free markets is that we are losing that shared understanding of virtue. It's time to renew our politics and to renew free market capitalism. Now, one man understood this all so well some 70 years ago. His name was Ludwig Erhard. I was reminding myself about his life and contribution ahead of this conference, and I want to finish with some Erhard quotes. Freedom and prosperity are inseparable. Both are key pillars of a thriving society. The role of government is not to control and regulate, but to create an environment where entrepreneurship can flourish. The state should be a referee, but never a player. A free and competitive economy has the power to lift individuals out of poverty and raise living standards. Excessive regulation stifles innovation and hampers economic growth. And a society that values personal responsibility and rewards initiative is bound to succeed. After the Second World War, Ludwig Erhard thought long and hard about the necessary foundations for a prosperous and flourishing society. He came up with what has been designated as the social market economy. You might call it the Bavarian model. We have lost sight of the Erhard principles. We need a return to the Bavarian model. I believe that if Ludwig Erhard were alive today, first of all, I would invite him to be on the ARC advisory board. And secondly, we would have a very good chance of persuading him to join us. Thank you.